Good afternoon, dear listener. Welcome to this series of conversations on debt and taxation from the East African Tax and Governance Network. My name is Tom Odhiambo. Hosting this program with me today is Professor Attiya Waris, who is an independent expert on foreign debt and other international financial obligations and human rights, and a professor of fiscal law at the University of Nairobi. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Professor, when we talk about tax and taxation,
Yes.
what should come to our mind instantly?
When you talk about tax, you should think about what your government is doing for you and how you have benefited throughout your life. Absolutely. That would be my takeaway.
Okay, good. But why do taxpayers tend to see tax as a burden rather than a common good, in a manner of speaking? Why?
So the challenge facing a lot of taxpayers is that when you're born and then until the age of 18, that's usually when you have received some kind of services, whether it is healthcare or public education, for example. But also, if you're walking on the roads and the roads have been built by the government or the train system, then these are the benefits that you see.
Yes.
However, by the time somebody turns 18 or 22 or 25 and they enter the job market and then they start paying income taxes specifically, the conversation that begins in their minds on taxation begins when you start paying for it, not when you start receiving services. Now, the moment you start paying for it, you don't always conceptualize that you've received services in the past. And so if you haven't figured that out yet, it immediately feels like a burden. So that's the first step. And then the second step becomes, as you grow older, if you don't see services coming in on a fairly regular basis, whether it is medicine in the clinics and the hospitals, or free services from a doctor, or even going into the education system, and now maybe universities, which are public in many parts of the world, then again, if you don't see that continual access to services, you will assume you're not benefiting. So that's the personal position. But the other position that's very important is that we don't just pay taxes for ourselves. We're supposed to pay taxes so that we help those who are also in need more than we are in need. And so you might go to a private school or go to a private hospital, but you should still put money into the public coffers to help those who cannot afford the same facilities that you can afford as an individual. And so there's both this sort of very selfish and internal reflection on tax, and then there's the external and how do we help community. And the thing is, when it comes to helping community, then everybody has a different opinion on whether they want to help others, how much they want to help others, whether people are deserving or not. And so the moment that conversation starts up, then there's a rejection of the purpose of the tax that is being put
But
in
nobody
place.
teaches you about taxes. Have you ever seen, having the formal school system, have you ever seen a story, a sustained story about why we should pay taxes?
Well, not in the East African region, but I have seen it in Rwanda. They had cartoon strips that talked about it. Japan has had cartoon strips as well. And the Finns have small books on it for children. So I think it is a conversation that needs to be had. I think it's a gap that is really important that we should start exploring across the world. And I think it's a really necessary conversation because young people are a lot more alert and dynamic than the older generation. There's also a big youth bulge, for example, across the world, especially on the African continent, which means that young people are going to be more in control than the older generations very soon. So if we don't make sure that they understand how systems work and then ask to remove systems they don't like, because of course that is the right of populations, then we will really have a problem, because then systems just might collapse because people don't quite understand why they're there in the first place.
So this lack of education, do you think it's one of the main reasons why governments struggle to collect taxes? Because I need a justification, I don't have a justification. Is this the main reason?
Well, I don't think it's the main reason. Okay, so we have like 200 countries in the world. So it's hard to say what's the main justification for these 200 governments, broadly.
Struggling to collect
Yes,
taxes.
there's many reasons why they struggle. But if I take our part of the world, which is the African continent, where we have a history of colonization, the challenge that we face in countries that have been colonized is that there isn't an understanding yet about the reason why taxes were put in place. And unfortunately, if you look at calls for independence, so for example, in my book on tax and development, when I talked about Kenya's independence, the original call for independence from the freedom fighters was actually redistribution of tax, not independence. So suddenly the conversation takes a slightly different tone. So I think redistribution has been a major pinching point, not to pay or not to pay. Are you spreading it properly? Are you spreading it correctly? And do people feel like you're spreading it in such a way that there is not just fairness in the system, but there's also a perception of it? Because sometimes I think perception destroys the good intentions of governments more than the reality of how they spend. I think that has been one of the biggest impediments. I think we are now coming of age where we have a robust system where many people are literate. We now have intergenerational education. And I think now is the time when you're going to be able to see people taking control of where they are going and what they need from their government. So I think we've just come of age, and then the demands are going to become more. But the refusal to pay is because also governments have not been bringing people onto the tax base. So one example, which I think is in my book on Financing Africa, was at a certain point in time, you would have like a population of 18 million in a country, for example, over the age of 18. And out of those 18 million, if you looked at the registration of numbers of taxpayers, it was as diverse as 99% in South Africa to 3% or 1% in Senegal. So you start to realize that people are not being registered on the tax base. And if you go and look into company registries, you will find that the place to register your company will be in the capital or the city or a city in a country. But you will not find roving desks to register. And getting an ID, getting a tax number, these are things that people struggle to get. And so I think there is an absence of ease in the system in getting registered. Now, if you look at countries in the global north, very, very often you're born with a number, and that's the number you stay with for the rest of your life. So when you turn 18, the tax issue kicks in. When you turn 21 in some countries, now you can take alcohol. But it's still the same number every single time. But if you look at many countries, in developing countries specifically, you might actually have even 8 or 9 different numbers. And nobody's going to remember 8 or 9 different numbers in today's world. It's
so
messy.
supposing we get the numbers that we need to be registered, essentially the government should be able to track everybody who is economically productive, right?
Absolutely.
Then the government collects the taxes. You already spoke about transparency. How do we improve? How do we engender transparency and openness in terms of both tax collection and the use of the revenue that the government receives?
So one of the things I look at as independent expert on foreign debt and international financial obligations is what are the big pressure points that we are feeling across the world? And I think one of the big pressure points right now is not just data, but it's also digitization. So governments are struggling with collecting data. So then you will say, okay, but then are we not in a digital age and can we not deal with it? But if I look at countries across the world, we have 40% internet penetration on the continent and 40% electricity penetration on the African continent. In Asia, it is a little bit different, but you still have irregular supplies of infrastructure. If you go into parts of Latin America, because I've been looking at it as well, data is not always publicly available. Now, these are different examples in different parts of the world, but one of the things that I've been pushing for is what I call fiscal legitimacy, which includes transparency. And that was my report in March to the Human Rights Council. And one of the arguments that I made is that you cannot have domestic systems continental systems or even global systems if we're not taking principles into account. So we can leave a lot of the conversations to diplomacy and debates, which is absolutely fine. But diplomacy and debates should not be allowed to push away principles that keep citizens knowledgeable and aware, that they can see their governments are accountable and being responsible. So we can't have this black box of data. So if I bring you back to what does it mean to not have this sort of black box of data, I mean, debt agreements are not public. So your country can sign an agreement for a bond with a private entity or with a public entity like the Bretton Woods institutions, but these debt agreements are not accessible to citizens in developing countries. So if you tie now this whole tax conversation we've been having, which is also used to pay off debt, right? And then you move it to the now we've taken on debt and we don't even know what we've signed up for, then why will the taxpayer want to pay you money when they don't know what you even took in the first place and how you intend to repay it? And this breaks in communication and information, which is where data sits, is probably the biggest impediment facing countries that are choosing not to give access to information, especially financial information, to their citizens.
Then it raises a question: what can ordinary citizens do to actually monitor use of the revenues? And for example, a government borrows a loan against the promise that they would repay based on the tax revenues. What are the practical ways that ordinary citizens can actually monitor the use of revenues and therefore have a reason to pay taxes to repay the loan in future?
So there are many entities across the world that are pushing for transparency in data. Unfortunately, transparency in debt agreements has not yet come to fruition. So there is a need for citizens across the world to ask that debt agreements be made clearly public and that all countries and their citizens get the right to access it, whether these are public debts or private debts. I would say at the most basic level, write to your member of parliament. And I don't think it's a small thing. We have what we call Twitter warriors. I think it's important that social media raises the issue. And I've noticed that when it happens on social media in some countries in the world, it does trigger serious conversations. But we also need these to be conversations in schools. We need these to be conversations in universities. Why are we not talking about the fact that we have a wonderful history globally of public universities, which are publicly funded by taxpayer money, for example? But when it comes to debt agreements, sometimes even these are compromised, and sometimes conditionalities are to semi-privatize universities. Now, this is the fabric of the country. Getting a well-educated population means better leaders, means better workers, means better quality of life, means a better, well-rounded human being as well. And I think that no matter what, certain things also have to be protected. So when you're having conversations about debt, you must at the same time also have a conversation about why the public education system must be kept robust. You have to tie it with a conversation on why your hospitals and clinics must have medicine. And this conversation with debt becomes very important. So what I see is the trends, and that's part of the work I do. So you'll see a debt agreement signed up, and then suddenly you will see a huge amount of money floating in that country. But you may be feeling happy because suddenly more people are buying the goods you're selling, or you're getting more work if you're a casual laborer, more construction is going on. But the big question you should ask yourself, even as you get more work and more employment and more profit, is where's the money coming from? And has it been spent legitimately? And these are questions I don't see business people or employees asking themselves. So we'll have more people, I don't know, doing catered parties, for example. But was that a catered party paid for by government money, and was it legitimate? And the thing is, you may have the party and have the great time and the money's finished, but that money may have been intended to buy, I don't know, HIV vaccines, HIV medication. It may have been intended to do research in some kind of new disease in the country. And I think making these connections is something that is becoming more and more important. And I think that is why also my mandate becomes so exciting, because it's not just about debt and international financial obligations. It's also about debt, international financial obligations, and its connection to human rights. So it's also about how are we spending it, but then how are we collecting it? And how are we making sure that the individual human being right at the bottom, the most vulnerable one, benefits and is a little bit less vulnerable through that process. And I think we have to become reflective as humanity in making those decisions when we make them.
Speaking of rights, you're also speaking of burdens. So I want you to speak a little bit to the debt burden across generations, the generational debt burden. A child who is in school today, a young man who is in college, and I'll come back to the question of education, about taxation at the college level, a woman who is at home who actually doesn't work but has a higher cost of imposed on her for what she buys for domestic use, and a retired civil servant, for example, a farmer in the countryside, a cobbler on the streets. I want you to speak to this because this is
Okay.
really important for us.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to say it like it's a story.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Right.
So debt can be taken at any time, right? In a country's lifespan. But we're just going to pick a particular point in time.
Yes.
A woman gets pregnant. She needs to take prenatal supplements.
Yes.
Okay? And 9 months later, if all goes well, the child will be born. And let's assume that when she gets pregnant, that's when a government takes on a loan or a debt.
Yes.
Now, normally debt gets, the interest on debt is paid after about 4 or 5 years, the first payment. So this child that this lady is now pregnant with is going to be born. So that's about 9 months on, 10 months on. Then 4 years later, the repayment cycle is kicking in for debt.
Yes.
So if this is a country that was fairly stable and the debt money came in and some of the money went into the healthcare system, then maybe she will get free checkups. And if she has to have a cesarean section, that's also covered, for example. And then the child is born. And because the child had prenatal vitamins, you have a healthy child born. And perhaps all of this was partially provided for by government through different types of taxes and finances from other sources. And the debt that's taken on is usually for a particular purpose. So maybe we're widening the road network. Maybe we're building a new big hospital or a university in Argentina. Because Argentina's peso over a year and a half ago was 250. And the last time I checked it, it was 800 pesos to the dollar.
The dollar.
Yes. Which means that if your salary is the same salary after a year and a half, now your child is 6.5, your packet of milk is 4 times.
What it was at birth.
But your salary is the same. Because it's the currency pushing the items price up and down. It's not the productivity or demand and supply like people like to say. It's because if I want to export, I want dollars. If I have to buy the packaging for the milk, I have to import it. I mean, all of these, every interaction that business will have with an external supplier is going to inflate the price of the domestic product as well. So these are now the things that start happening. So now the child is growing older, they're going to school, but now they will say, we have to pay off the debt, and the teachers cannot get their raise. And if the teachers cannot get their raise, then they will start doing tuitions, for example, after school. And in some countries in the world, it is banned. Or they will have to get another job because they have to make ends meet. So what happens? The quality of your education goes down because your teacher is tired.
Yes.
And then in the evening, they're doing another job so that they can just put food on their tables and still stay in the same house. And if they can't do that, then what you have is a situation where the middle class now moves into the lower classes and start moving into cheaper housing because it's about survival. Now, that human being knows that they cannot live in debt, but the country is living in debt. And I think this is the conversation or the logic that I always find is a struggle. If we as individual human beings know we cannot live in debt, why is it that we think that countries can live in debt for years?
Exactly.
The child is still not even a teenager. Now our child goes to high school, hopefully is healthy, hopefully the schooling system is still there, but we have fewer secondary schools. So for every one child going into high school, maybe 5 or 8 or 10 don't. So you're cutting the ability of a young person to join the workforce as an economically productive person already at 12. So you have despondent people, you have sad children. This is not a good state of affairs. Now you move it forward. Fast forward 8 years, let's assume everybody who wanted an education got one. We're now in the workforce. Now you're faced by the child who's saying, why should I pay money? Look, 5 of my cousins didn't finish high school. 3 of my friends sit next to the coffee shop outside and have no work. You know, these are now the lived realities of people in developing countries. Now, at the 20-year mark, remember the interest rate was being paid. So as the child hits 15, still interest rate only, hits 20, still interest rates only. But when they hit 25, now you have to pay the full amount. So if you think the currency was already fluctuating and the economy was already unstable when the child was still growing, can you imagine what happens when you're faced as a government or leadership with paying off, I don't know, $20 billion like that? The one thing I haven't talked about is the electoral cycle, because this is not going to be the same government that took the loan. Electoral cycles are 2 5-year cycles or 2 7-year cycles, depending on where you are.
Yes.
So your allegedly democratic country has a situation where the person who took on the debt, the government that survived 5 years without paying interest rates, is
Retired.
not the one who's going to be
In office.
left holding the baby.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So this then produces a cycle of poor people with a higher debt burden,
Yes.
right? Then how do we start to address that at the basic level, right from the house? How do we start? Because you've introduced politics. It's these poor people who elect the politicians,
Yes.
but the debt burden is the biggest problem they have to live with.
Yes.
So how do we start to address that question
I think
from
the
this poor level?
I actually think that the most important answer is the information access. Because I think if enough people can see those debt agreements, then the power politics in the debt agreements gets muted also quite a bit. I mean, let's give you a very bizarre example. There has been situations where countries are told if they don't do something in their laws, they won't get a debt or they wouldn't be eligible for debt.
For a loan, yes.
Yes. So let's say if you don't set up a casino in your country, or if you don't, I don't know, legalize alcohol, let's pick something that is a little bit, hopefully a little bit neutral, but a tad emotive. So if you don't legalize gambling in this country, we're not going to give you debt money. If you don't legalize alcohol, we're not going to give you debt money. But the question in my mind is, at the point in time when you can write a clause like that in a debt agreement,
Yes.
you're changing the entire culture and fabric of a country, and they have no idea. So it's not just about the money. It's about these other clauses that you start to see finding themselves into debt agreements. The one that is the most common right now, which I think is quite counterintuitive, and I have raised this to the IMF officially through my mandate, is giving tax breaks in order to get a debt. But you should pay the debt using tax.
Yes.
So if I give you a tax, if you tell me I have to give you a tax break,
Yes.
but I'm taking debt money, then how am I going to pay off my debt?
It's a trap.
I think it's like counterintuitive. It doesn't make logical sense to me.
But why are tax breaks quite popular, let's say, in the global south? Are they really imposed, or is this something that people agree to? Because following on that, I would then pause in advance right now. Is it a cultural thing that we in the global south quite readily accept this trap of tax breaks to foreign investors?
Okay, so they're like 4 questions there.
Yes.
But I'll try and take the ones I can. If I forget any, you can let me know. So what I find fascinating when it comes to taxations, remember, these agreements are private, not public.
Yeah.
So I only get to hear about them through leakages. And then there's some civil societies that find information, they post them online. And then if you look at leakages of information,
Yes.
that's how I find
Yes.
this information. But this whole argument about give tax breaks to companies, it's usually companies, or it's high net worth individuals, comes from some kind of understanding that taxes are like a cost or an expenditure. Instead of seeing them as what they are, if a company invests in a country, then they're going to use the local infrastructure. They're going to use the roads. They're going to use the electricity. They're going to use the water services. But if you're going to use our airport, you're going to use our port. If you're going to use the domestic infrastructure, you should also contribute to the communal pool. But for some reason, countries were advised, and this is unfortunately decades ago, they were advised that they needed to give tax breaks in order to be competitive. Now, this may sound weird, but I am the first tax law professor in the country.
Yes.
I'm the first fiscal law professor on the continent. So if you want to look at capacity, I don't think people understood what they were agreeing to at a certain point.
Could I cut in and say, would somebody imagine that this was deliberate? That how can an entire continent not have produced capacity in this area 60 years after kind of departure of colonial occupiers? Just that it's a break in between so that you can continue.
No, I'm not a believer in conspiracy theories at that
Exactly.
level. I don't think so. But it's about when a country is ready for it, right?
Yes.
So you'll produce lawyers.
Yes.
But then you'll produce the specialized lawyers.
Yes.
So now we're in that space,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
You'll produce the medical doctor, but then when will you produce the pediatrician?
Yes.
First, you have to have many medical doctors, right?
Yes, okay.
So I think that's probably
Okay.
where it has come from. I'm less. I don't think there's any diabolical
Okay, I'll agree
plan
with
for
you.
that.
Okay.
But somewhere along the way, they thought that tax breaks was something you could deal with.
Yes.
Now, over the years, many of the research entities have actually been checking to see why does a company enter a country? Why does a company invest in a country? Companies invest because you have something they cannot get anywhere else. So it's either it's minerals, for example, you have oil, you have diamonds, whatever it is, or you have a very stable political climate. And in that list of 12, 15 choices, tax comes out as like number 6, number 8, or number 12.
Really?
Yeah. So this was like a fallacy. People thought if you made things less expensive, more people would come. But in reality, the number one consistent indicator is peace and stability, and then it's political peace and stability, and then it's lack of corruption. So there are other issues that are of a greater priority, which makes me think, like, why is everyone paying attention to my tax base? My tax base is not the answer. There's a different space where the answer is. So these are the sort of issues that I tend to look at and hope that people will sort of see the reality of where they live and then try and bring it together. But then the question, I think the biggest question you've asked so far is, how do we get the people who are in abject poverty to be able to now engage in this space? And I think that it's probably through things like value-added tax. But if you look at people in the villages, you'll get milk from your neighbor, eggs from your garden, vegetables. Everything is very communal and it's off the tax base. Nothing wrong with that. But when it comes to school uniforms and books and medication, then there are taxes. If you're going to go and buy flour from the shops, you're going to buy phone credit.
Yes.
All of these have taxes. And I am of the belief that there should be a certain basket of goods which at a certain amount do not attract value added tax. Absolutely. Because VAT, for example, has been criticized as being one of the most regressive taxes in the world. Recently, there was a paper saying there may be a way to redesign it. But the chances of that reaching the developing world soon is very low. So there should be a minimum basket, which they're exempt. The same way income tax, if you earn less than a certain amount, you don't pay income tax.
Yeah.
There has to be that. And then once they understand that now they have more money in their pockets because they qualify, then you can begin to have the conversation of, okay, so now would you be willing to give? And there's a very interesting study I did in Rwanda many years ago now. Rwanda has this one cow a project policy, one cow a family policy.
Family,
yes. And it was fascinating because you got the cow, but the moment the cow had a calf, the calf goes to the next family.
Okay.
That don't have a cow yet.
Yeah.
So the government started by, I think, airlifting 600 or 60 cows from Germany. It was fascinating. These beautiful black and white cows are like dotted on the hills in Rwanda.
Rwanda, yes.
So I went a step further. I went and asked people who had cows, do you pay taxes? And they said no. I said, would you pay 50 Rwandan francs to the government every year, seeing as what you've benefited from? And they said yes. And I kept raising the figure until I hit the $1 a year mark. And this was in about 2015. And then when I said, okay, how about $2 a year? And then they were like, okay, that might be a little difficult for us. But even though that's a really low amount, the point is there's some commitment. There's something coming. There's this element of some gratitude for somebody that lives in a mud hut, whose child goes to the public school for public education, who received a single cow. And now each of their children have a laptop.
Which speaks to your book, right? Financing Africa, which I read years ago. And I thought it was a kind of a manifesto of how we can live within our own means. Just speak a little bit to that.
So this book was a journey of 15 years. I know you said you read it a long time ago, but it came out in 2019, so it's not so old.
Yeah.
It's now 5 years. Took me 15 years to try and understand how to understand my continent. And one of the biggest things that pushed me to write this book was because people said you cannot map out the African continent. Mm-hmm. And so every time they would sign agreements or debate on the size of an economy, they would say, oh yeah, but the data is not good and we can't find information. And so I wrote this with two things in mind: to prove that we were mappable, that it was possible to map the continent out.
Data-wise.
Yes, data-wise. Mm. And then to say, well, yeah, okay, the data is not perfect, but no country in the world has got perfect data anyway. But at least we have taken that first step. We've mapped it. So this is actually the first book of its kind globally. The funny thing is that the Latin Americans want me to do one for them as well, because apparently they don't have it either.
Okay.
But what I really love about my book is that I also try to make it understandable for people without a background in tax or finance. Okay. I've used African proverbs and all sorts of cultural connections, I hope, from across the continent so that people could actually get it. And one of the important things I think comes from the book is that once you finish going through it, you can actually see your continent. You can understand it. And hopefully you can now understand your government and the challenges that it faces.
So as you go towards the end, let's talk a little bit about what does the digital era give both the citizens, the taxpayers, and the government in this process of kind of reaching a meeting point? What does digitization do to taxation, revenues, debt, etc.?
So digitization makes information move very fast and sometimes in incomplete pieces. Yeah. So it's good because the people can get better access and knowledge to information. The negative part of it is what I mentioned, this 40% internet penetration on the continent, for example, means that if you are extremely poor and cannot afford a smartphone, you really will be off the grid when it comes to being able to hold your government accountable and get knowledge. But I think the most important thing which I see coming out of the financing spaces and digitization is the creation of artificial entities. You can now create a company in, I don't know, Argentina, but it will look like it's based in Liechtenstein and the bank will be in the Bahamas. Like, this is what digitization allows. So it basically allows for upper middle, and upper class people to become extremely mobile and to be completely off the net of a government if they want to be. And I think this is a problem because then that responsibility of supporting a country then gets pushed down towards the middle and the lower classes. And so I think what we need to do with digitization is to take it very carefully, but to also make sure that everybody continues to pay their fair share. Most importantly, the wealthy. Although a lot of our conversation has been on the poor, I think the responsibility in a digital age rests very squarely on people who have wealth, who are now utilizing the routes that you can find online to actually remove their finances from a country and not pay their fair share of tax. I don't say pay what you're not supposed to pay. They should pay, but their fair share of tax. Because I think if they paid it, maybe you wouldn't have to pay tax below earning $5,000 a month. I mean, it can actually happen if we're all in it, because across the world, it's on average 30 to 40% of human beings are paying their income taxes in some parts of the world, especially the developing countries.
Okay, the last word, it's about your work. What should we expect of your work? So it's a global a job that is really looking at a very difficult subject, a subject that not necessarily all governments will be excited about, multinational corporations and particular individuals. What should we expect of it?
So I'm now 2.5 years in the mandate.
Yes.
I'll be there for, God willing, another 3.5 years. And I think what you have to look forward to is hopefully being able to better understand the connections between debt and tax, illicit financial flows, and how it affects the human being on the ground. One of the things that I have been really focusing on is not just looking at small countries, but also conflict-prone countries. But I'm also looking at issues around militarization and the amount of finance it takes away from development and growth and human rights as well. So over the next 3 years, the plan is to open up new spaces and open up new conversations. My mandate is what is called a contested mandate. There are countries that permanently believe or have permanently believed for the past 30 years that it shouldn't exist because it's a 30-year-old mandate. But I think that even the ones that don't support its existence benefit from the conversations I bring to the table, because at an international level, I try and make the issues of the financial realities and the implications that financial decisions have on the ability of sometimes a human being to actually live. And I think being able to make that connection is, I hope, what I will leave behind once I'm done. But I should point out that it is not a job. I'm an independent expert, which means that I am not an employee of the United Nations. I am independent and unbiased, and I am as quick to send a letter to entities within the UN as I am to send to those around the world.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Attiya.
Thank you.
We hope that the lessons you offer us here will be lessons that can actually be learned both locally, regionally, and internationally. We hope to see you again on this series.
Thank you very much.